The refugee center kitchen smelled like failure and recycled air. Across the galaxy, alien children starved not from lack of food, but from a truth no one understood. Some species cannot eat what they believe is already dead. And in that kitchen, where 19 human chefs had already quit, a single father with flour-dusted hands was about to discover that 128 folds of butter and dough could mean the difference between a child's surrender and her survival. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The interstellar refugee center sat like a bruise on the edge of Covenant Station, all gray, steel, and flickering lights that hummed with the exhaustion of a place built for crisis and abandoned to routine. Rhys Turner stood at the kitchen threshold, his daughter Lily's hand tucked into his, and studied the space that would either save them or break them. The counters stretched long and sterile beneath lights that bleached color from everything they touched. Ventilation ducts rattled overhead. The smell hit him first. Synthetic protein paste, a stringent cleaning solution, and underneath it all, the sour tang of food gone uneaten. Dr. Amara Osei, the human coordinator, moved through the kitchen with the brisk efficiency of someone who had stopped apologizing for impossible situations. Her locks were tied back with a faded silk scarf, and her eyes carried the particular weariness of those who care too much in a system designed for too little. She gestured to the industrial mixers, the vacuum sealers, the protein synthesizers that gleamed like medical equipment. "You're the 20th chef in 3 months," said Amara. "The children won't eat. We've tried everything." Rhys set down his knife roll, the leather worn soft from 15 years of use. Inside, his santoku, his boning knife, his bread lame with its curved blade sharp enough to split dough without tearing. Tools his wife had given him one at a time, each birthday and anniversary building toward the kitchen they would share. Lily pressed closer to his side, 8 years old and already familiar with the weight of starting over. "What have you tried?" said Rhys. Amara pulled up a datapad, her finger scrolling through menus that read like surrender. Nutritional paste optimized for cross-species digestion. Flavor profiles adjusted to match their homeworld databases. Temperature variations, texture modifications. We even brought in a Vayari chef who lasted 2 days before she called them ungrateful and left. Through the kitchen's viewing window, Rhys could see the dining hall. Rows of tables bolted to the floor. Alien children of a dozen species sitting in segregated clusters, their plates untouched. Some were tall and willowy with skin that shimmered like oil on water. Others were compact and armored, their carapaces dull from malnutrition. A few were almost human in shape, but wrong in ways that made the eye skip. Too many joints, eyes that tracked independently, mouths that opened vertically instead of horizontally. "They're starving," said Lily quietly. Her voice carried the particular clarity of children who have learned that speaking truth is sometimes the only power they have. Amara's jaw tightened. "Yes," said Amara. Rhys watched a Kavari administrator move through the hall, her crystalline skin refracting the overhead lights into cold rainbows. She placed a bowl before a small figure huddled at the farthest table, her movements efficient and empty of warmth. The child didn't look up. Sarah sat alone at the table farthest from the kitchen, her pale blue skin nearly translucent in the harsh light. She was small, perhaps the equivalent of 6 or 7 in human years, with limbs that seemed too delicate to carry even her slight weight. Her bioluminescent patterns, the marks that should have pulsed with the pursued, rhythms of health and emotion, flickered weakly like dying stars. Behind her, keeping distance but never leaving, stood her older sister, Vera. Purple-skinned with hair the color of new leaves, Vera's eyes tracked every movement in the hall with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that safety was a lie told by those who had never lost everything. Rhys moved closer to the viewing window. The Kavari administrator, whose nameplate read Vokrin, set the bowl before Sarah with a click of ceramic on metal. Nutritional paste, gray-green and trembling slightly with whatever kept it suspended between liquid and solid. Sarah's head turned away as if the smell caused physical pain. "Eat," said Vokrin. The translator rendered her voice flat and mechanical. Your sister cannot carry you forever. Vera's hand moved to Sarah's shoulder, a gesture that held too much. Protection, desperation, fury carefully leashed. Sarah remained motionless. The paste sat untouched. Around them, other children made minimal efforts, forcing down mouthfuls that their bodies accepted and their spirits rejected. But Sarah simply stared at the wall, her breathing shallow, her luminescence dimming with each passing day. How long has she refused food? Said Reese. Amara checked her records. 18 days. She takes water, sometimes. We've had to use intravenous nutrition twice. She's dying, Chef Turner, and we don't know why. Reese watched the way Sarah's fingers trembled against the table edge, the way her sister's hand tightened protectively, the way Vokrin walked away with the satisfaction of someone who had fulfilled a duty without understanding its purpose. He had seen this before. Not the species, not the setting, but the shape of it. Lily had stopped eating for 2 months after her mother died, pushing away every meal until Reese learned that grief sometimes needed to be fed differently than hunger. She's not refusing food, said Reese. She's refusing death. Amara turned to him, confusion creasing her forehead. I don't understand, said Amara. Reese pointed to the paste, to the synthesizers, to the vacuum-sealed packages stacked in the storage area. Everything here is processed, broken down, rendered into components. To us, it's efficient. To her, he watched Syrah's luminescence flicker. Once, weekly, it might be corpses. That's absurd, said Vokrin, who had returned to the kitchen door. Her crystalline face refracted her disdain into a dozen angles. We have analyzed their nutritional requirements precisely. The paste contains everything their biology needs. Reese picked up his knife roll. Everything except a reason to live, said Reese. Vokrin's face hardened into sharp geometry. You have 1 week, Chef Turner. If the children do not eat, your contract ends, and we return to standard protocol. She left. Amara exhaled slowly. Standard protocol means feeding tubes and sedation, said Amara. Lily tugged her father's hand. Dad, said Lily. Her voice was small but certain. Make them what Mom used to make when I couldn't eat. Reese knelt beside his daughter, eye to eye. Croissants take 3 days, sweetheart, said Reese. Lily looked through the window at Sarah. Then we should start now, said Lily. 3 in the morning and the kitchen belonged to ghosts. Reese stood at the steel counter, with flour dusting his forearms like snow, measuring by weight and memory. 500 grams of bread flour, 10 grams of salt, 50 grams of sugar, 300 grams of milk, warmed until his finger could rest in it without flinching. The measurements were muscle memory now, carved into his hands by repetition and loss. Lily slept in the small quarters adjacent to the kitchen, curled beneath a thermal blanket printed with stars that didn't match any constellation Earth had ever known. She had insisted on staying close, the way she always did when her father worked through the night. Through the door he could hear her breathing, steady and sure, the sound that kept him tethered when grief tried to pull him under. He added the yeast, watched it bloom in the warm milk like tiny flowers opening. His wife had taught him this, not from a recipe but from her hands to his, guiding his fingers through the motions until the knowledge lived in his body rather than his mind. She had learned from her grandmother, who had learned from hers. A chain of care stretching back through generations, who understood that some kinds of love could only be spoken in butter and flour. The dough came together beneath his palms. He kneaded until it grew smooth and elastic, until it breathed with him, expanding and contracting like a second heartbeat. Then he shaped it into a rectangle, wrapped it carefully, and set it in the cooling unit to rest. The first fold would come in the morning. For now, the dough needed time to remember itself. Behind him, the kitchen door whispered open. Vera stood in the threshold, her purple skin darker in the dim light, her eyes reflecting the safety lights like a cat's. She did not enter. She simply watched him work with an intensity that made the air feel fragile. Your sister, said Reese quietly. What did she eat before? Vera's bioluminescent patterns flickered across her collarbone, colors he had no names for. Living grain, said Vera, blessed by singers, transformed through days of care. Her voice carried harmonics that the translator flattened into something almost human. We do not eat death. We eat what death becomes when touched by intention. Reese pulled the butter from cold storage. 250 grams, cold enough to shatter if struck. He began working it with his hands, warming it just enough to make it pliable, folding it into a square exactly half the size of his dough. This would be the heart of everything, the element that would split each layer into 2, then 4, then 8, doubling with each turn until the dough held 128 distinct layers, each one separate and complete. Transformation through care, said Reese. Vera's patterns brightened slightly. You understand, said Vera. Reese looked at the dough resting in the cooling unit, at the butter square waiting on the counter, at the hours of folding and turning that stretched ahead. I'm learning, said Reese. Dawn broke across Covenant Station in shades of bronze and violet, light filtered through atmospheric shields that turned every sunrise into something alien and beautiful. Reese had not slept. The dough rested on the counter before him, cold and ready, patient as stone. He placed the butter square at its center, folded the dough over it like tucking a child into bed, and sealed the edges with the heel of his hand. The first turn began. He pressed the rolling pin down the length of the dough, feeling the butter resist and then surrender, spreading between the layers in a sheet so thin it became more idea than substance. When the rectangle stretched long enough, he folded it into thirds, letter style, creating the first, multiplication. 2 layers became 6. He turned it 90 degrees, wrapped it, returned it to the cold. Sierra appeared in the doorway like a whisper made visible. Her pale blue skin caught the early light, and for a moment Reese could see the pattern of her bioluminescence more clearly, spirals that began at her wrists and wound up her arms like water flowing in reverse. She was so thin that the edge of the doorframe seemed wider than her shoulders, her eyes, large and dark as tidal pools, fixed on the dough with an attention that felt holy. Reese did not speak. He had learned from Lily that sometimes silence was the only invitation worth giving. He simply continued his work, pulling the dough from the cold after its rest, positioning it on the counter, beginning the second turn. Press, roll, fold. The rhythm was meditation. The butter whispered between the layers, invisible but present, the ghost that would make everything rise. Sarah took one step into the kitchen, then another. Her feet made no sound on the recycled composite floor. Vera materialized behind her, protective as a shadow, but she did not stop her sister's approach. Sarah moved to the counter's edge and stood on her toes to see over it. Her breathing quickened. Her luminescent patterns began to pulse with something that might have been curiosity or might have been hunger or might have been hope. Reese finished the second fold and wrapped the dough again. He held up 2 fingers. 2 turns, said Reese. 4 more to go. Then it rests until tomorrow. Sierra reached out one trembling hand toward the dough, then pulled it back as if afraid of contamination. Reese took a small scrap of dough from his initial mixing, a piece he had kept aside for testing. He had not added butter to this piece. It was just flour and water and time, but he had kneaded it with the same care he gave everything. He held it out to her on his palm. Not dead, said Reese. Becoming. Her sister's patterns flickered in, a sequence too fast for Reese to follow, some kind of communication beyond human comprehension. Then Vera nodded once, a gesture that transcended species. Sarah took the dough scrap between her fingers. It was still cool from the refrigeration. She brought it close to her face, and her breathing changed. The patterns on her skin brightened, colors cycling through blues and silvers that made the kitchen feel suddenly larger. She did not eat it. She held it like a treasure, like a promise. And Reese understood that trust, like laminated dough, required multiple folds before it could rise. The third day arrived, with Reese's hands aching and his heart strangely light. The dough had been folded 6 times now, rested between each turn, the butter multiplying into 64 invisible sheets. Sarah had returned each morning, always silent, always watching. She kept the scrap of dough in a small container Vera had found, checking it periodically as if it might disappear. Lily helped with the final turns, her small hands learning the rhythm under her father's guidance. She rolled while he steadied the dough, her tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration. The kitchen had become a chapel of flour and patience, and even Vokrin's daily inspections had grown quieter, as if the administrator sensed something she could not quantify happening in the spaces between measurements. After the sixth fold, Reese cut the dough into triangles. Sarah watched each cut with an intensity that made the air feel electric. Her luminescence pulsed faster now, no longer the dim flicker of those first days. Vera stood close enough to translate, her voice carrying harmonics that made the words feel like music. "She asks why you cut what you have built," said Vera. Reese held up one triangle, showing Sarah the layers visible at its edge. Faint striations of butter and dough, separate but unified. "To become what it's meant to be," said Reese. "Everything that rises must first be divided." He rolled the first triangle from base to tip, forming the crescent shape. His fingers worked with gentle pressure, coaxing rather than forcing. Sarah leaned closer, her breath fogging the steel counter. When he placed the shaped croissant on the baking sheet, she touched the counter where it had been, tracing invisible patterns with her fingertip. Vera's patterns shifted into deeper purples. "She says this is like the folding song," said Vera. "The ritual her people performed before the war came. They would take living grain and fold it with blessed oils, singing at each turn. 6 days of folding. On the 7th day, they would bake it in ovens carved from sacred stone." Reese paused, his hands still on the dough. 6 folds, said Reese. Vera's voice dropped to something close to reverence. "You could not have known," said Vera. Reese met her eyes. "I didn't need to know your ritual to understand that care repeated becomes prayer," said Reese. Lily finished rolling her first croissant. It was lumpy and asymmetrical, but she had followed each step with the seriousness of someone performing surgery. She placed it on the sheet beside her father's perfect crescents. Sarah's hand reached out, hovering over Lily's croissant, and then slowly, carefully, she let her fingers rest on its surface. The translation came through Vera in a whisper. "She says she can feel it breathing," said Vera. Reese covered the shaped croissants with a cloth and set them in the warming box for their final rise. 2 hours of proofing, the yeast waking and stretching. Then he would bake them. The croissants rose in the dark. The oven heat rolled across the kitchen in waves that shimmered like summer roads. Reese pulled the first tray of croissants from the rack, their surfaces bronze and blistered, their scent filling the air with butter and yeast and something older than either, the smell of intention made manifest. Steam rose from their seams where the 128 layers had finally separated in the heat, creating the honeycomb structure that made them more air than bread. Sarah stood at the counter, Vera beside her, both watching with an attention that made Reese move carefully, as if one wrong gesture might shatter whatever fragile thing was being built between them. Lily clutched his sleeve, her own anticipation, a physical presence in the small space. Other children had gathered at the dining hall window, drawn by the smell, their faces pressed to the glass like flowers turning toward the sun. Reese placed one croissant on a simple white plate. It was still too hot to eat, the interior steaming, but he broke it open anyway. The layers pulled apart with a whisper of sound, revealing the pale yellow interior, each striation visible and distinct. He set the open croissant before Sarah and stepped back, giving her space to choose. She stared at it for a long moment. Her luminescent patterns began to cycle through colors. Reese had never seen her display, moving so fast they blurred into something like light through a prism. Her hands trembled. Vera's own patterns answered in a slower rhythm, encouraging, protective, afraid. Sarah reached out with both hands and lifted the croissant half. She brought it close to her face, breathing in the steam. Her eyes closed. A sound came from her throat, untranslatable, something between a sob and a song. When she opened her eyes again, tears tracked down her pale blue cheeks, catching the light like mercury. She took a bite. The layers shattered between her teeth, butter and air and flour transformed into something that had never been any of those things alone. Her luminescence exploded across her skin, patterns racing from her fingertips to her shoulders, down her spine, across her face. Colors that had no names in human language, emotions that had no translation, a response so visceral that Vera gasped and pressed her hand to her own chest, as if feeling her sister's joy secondhand. Sarah ate. Not delicately, not slowly. She consumed the croissant with the desperation of someone who had been drowning and finally found air. When she finished, she looked at Reese with eyes that held galaxies, and spoke. The translator rendered it simply, but Vera's harmonic undertones carried the true weight. "More," said Sarah. Within the hour, 30 croissants cooled on racks across every available surface. The children pressed into the kitchen, hesitant and hungry. Reese handed out croissants with Lily's help, and Amara's, and finally, Vera's. Each child who tasted them displayed their own luminescence, their own language of relief, and Sarah, surrounded by others eating for the first time in weeks, spoke again. "Thank you," said Sarah. Vokrin arrived at the kitchen door with a data pad clutched in her crystalline hand and fury refracting through every angle of her face. Behind her, 2 Kavari enforcers stood silent as monuments, their bodies translucent enough to show the mechanical augmentations beneath their skin. Morning shift had barely begun, but already the dining hall hummed with unusual energy. Children ate. They laughed. They asked for seconds. "This ends today," said Vokrin. Reese was elbow-deep in flour, preparing his second batch of dough. Lily sat at the corner table folding napkins with Sarah, their heads bent together over the simple task, 2 children speaking in the universal language of companionship. He did not stop working. The dough required his attention more than Vokrin's anger did. "You have violated 17 efficiency protocols," said Vokrin. She tapped her data pad, each touch punctuating her grievance. "Unauthorized ingredient expenditure. Deviation from approved nutritional schedules, waste of energy resources, and most egregiously, you have encouraged emotional dependency in vulnerable populations." Reese shaped the butter into its square, his movements calm and precise. "The children are eating," said Reese. Vokrin's face hardened into sharp facets. "They are eating inefficiently," said Vokrin. "Your croissants require 3 days of labor, specialized equipment, and ingredients that cost 4 times the standard allocation. This is not sustainable. This is not replicable. This is one human's vanity masquerading as care." Amara appeared in the doorway behind the enforcers, her expression carefully neutral but her hands clenched at her sides. "Administrator Vokrin, the health metrics show significant improvement across all species," said Amara. "Weight gain, increased activity levels, reduction in stress hormones. Whatever Chef Turner is doing, it's working." Vokrin turned her refracted glare on Amara. "Metrics can be manipulated by temporary emotional spikes," said Vokrin. "What happens when this human leaves? When the children must return to standard nutrition? You are teaching them to expect miracles. You are setting them up for deeper trauma when reality reasserts itself." Reese folded the dough over the butter, sealed the edges, began the first turn. His voice remained level, almost gentle. "You're right," said Reese. Vokrin blinked, her certainty fracturing slightly. "I am right," said Vokrin. Reese met her eyes. "This isn't sustainable." "Not if I'm the only one doing it," said Reese. "So I'm teaching anyone who wants to learn." 5 parents asked for the recipe yesterday. "Doctor, Jose is setting up a rotation schedule. By next week, we'll have enough people trained that croissants can be part of the regular morning offering." "That is not," said Vokrin, but her voice had lost its edge. "The children need nutrition," said Reese. He pressed the rolling pin down the length of the dough, steady and sure. "But they also need a reason to accept it. You can force-feed a body. You can't force-feed a spirit. These croissants aren't miracles. They're just proof that someone cares enough to spend 3 days making something beautiful for them." Sarah appeared at his elbow. holding an empty plate. She looked at Vokrin with eyes that had regained their light. "More," said Sarah. The kitchen at dawn became a gathering place. What began with Reese and Lily expanded like dough in warm air, drawing in others who had forgotten that feeding people could mean more than fulfilling a contract. Dr. Amara Osei arrived first, her hands uncertain but willing. Then came Kess's father, a Thraxian mechanic whose armored fingers proved surprisingly gentle with laminated dough. A human nurse named Tobias. 2 Veyari teachers whose luminescent patterns pulsed in rhythm as they worked. Reese moved between them like a conductor, his voice low and patient. "Fold from the center outward. Keep the butter cold. If it melts, the layers fuse and everything collapses. Respect the rest periods. The dough tells you when it's ready." They worked in silence mostly, the kind of quiet that comes when people focus on something larger than themselves. Lily taught Sarah how to brush egg wash across the shaped croissants, their 2 small hands guiding the pastry brush in tandem. Vera watched from the doorway, her protective stance softening incrementally as she saw her sister smile. By the 3rd morning, they had 40 croissants cooling on racks. By the 5th, 70. The dining hall transformed. Children who had sat in isolated clusters began to mix, drawn together by the shared language of warm bread and melted butter. A small Thraxian girl offered half her croissant to a Veyari boy. He accepted with luminescent gratitude. Vokrin's opposition hardened in proportion to their success. She filed formal complaints with station administration, citing resource allocation violations and unauthorized training programs. She posted enforcers at the kitchen door during peak hours, monitoring ingredient usage with mechanical precision. She scheduled mandatory staff meetings designed to conflict with baking schedules. The staff came anyway. They brought their own butter, their own flour, supplies purchased from personal accounts, or bartered from merchant ships passing through. When Vokrin locked the industrial ovens, they borrowed portable units from the station's market district. When she restricted kitchen access to certified personnel only, Reese held training sessions in his quarters, teaching the theory of lamination on paper until they could practice with dough again. The children staged their own quiet resistance. They refused the nutrition paste with a politeness that somehow cut deeper than shouting. They sat at tables with empty plates, hands folded, waiting. When Vokrin threatened disciplinary action, Sarah stood on her chair and spoke in her musical language, Vera translating with tears in her eyes. "We have eaten death for too long," said Sarah. "Now we know what it means to eat life. We will wait for life." Other children stood, 30 voices in a dozen languages, all saying the same thing. "We will wait." Vokrin stared at them, her crystalline face refracting the overhead lights into fractured rainbows. She opened her mouth to speak, to command, to reassert the efficiency that had always been her gospel. But in that moment, facing children who had chosen hunger over surrender, she found she had nothing to say. She left without a word. Inspector Kalin arrived on the morning of the 8th day, his credentials flashing across every security checkpoint between the docking bay and the refugee center. He was Orvathi, a species known for bureaucratic precision and absolute adherence to galactic health codes. His skin held the texture of polished stone, gray and immovable, and his eyes scanned environments the way predators scanned prey, looking for weakness and violation. Vokrin met him at the entrance with triumph barely concealed beneath professional courtesy. "The violations are extensive," said Vokrin. "Unsanctioned food preparation, emotional manipulation of vulnerable populations, refusal to comply with efficiency standards. I have documented everything." Kalin's stone face revealed nothing. "Show me," said Kalin. They walked through the facility in grim procession. Vokrin presented her evidence with prosecutorial efficiency. Ingredient expenditure reports showing costs 4 times the approved budget. Energy consumption graphs spiking during unauthorized baking hours. Testimony from staff members who complained about the additional labor requirements. And finally, the kitchen itself, where Reese stood with flour on his hands and Lily at his side, shaping the morning's batch. "Inspector Kalin," said Reese. His voice carried no deference, no fear, just acknowledgement. Kylan studied the operation with mechanical attention. He examined the dough, the butter measurements, the precise temperature controls. He reviewed the lamination process, counting the folds, calculating the mathematical progression, 6 turns, 64 layers of butter, 128 total layers of dough and fat, each one microscopically thin, each one essential to the structure. "This is extraordinarily inefficient," said Kylan. "Yes," said Reese. Kylan turned to the dining hall where children ate their breakfast with an enthusiasm that bordered on reverence. "The health metrics are impressive," said Kylan, "but metrics can be temporary. What happens when you leave?" Before Reese could answer, Sarah entered the kitchen. She moved with confidence now, her luminescence bright and steady, her steps sure. She carried a croissant on a small plate, one she had helped fold and shape under Lily's guidance. She approached the inspector and held it out to him with both hands, a gesture that carried ceremonial weight. Vera followed, translating. "My sister says she wants to show you why 128 layers matter," said Vera. Sarah began to count. Her fingers touched the croissant's edge, tracing each visible layer, and she sang. The numbers became music in her language, each one a note in a progression that built like a hymn. 1, 2, 3, 4. The counting continued, her voice never wavering, her luminescent patterns pulsing in rhythm. 32, 64, 96. Other children gathered, adding their voices in their own languages. 100, 110, 120, 128, said Sarah. She broke the croissant open, the layers separated like pages in a sacred text. She offered half to Inspector Kylan. He took it. He tasted it. His translator went silent. Then, quietly, "I had forgotten food could mean this." Inspector Kylan's report took 3 days to process through galactic bureaucracy, but when it arrived, it carried the weight of transformation. The refugee center's kitchen was granted expanded status as a cultural preservation program, with funding allocated not for efficiency but for care. Vokrin was reassigned to a deep space logistics station where her precision would be valued and her rigidity would harm no one. The children kept eating. Reese opened the kitchen to anyone willing to learn. Humans taught aliens the language of laminated dough, and aliens taught humans the songs their people had sung over rising bread before war scattered them across the galaxy. The counter became a meeting place where species who had never spoken learned to fold butter into flour side by side, their hands moving in the same ancient rhythm. Sarah thrived. Her luminescence grew so bright that she sometimes lit the kitchen better than the overhead panels. She kept one croissant in a preservation box on the shelf beside her bed, not to eat but to remember. Vera told Reese what it meant to her sister. "The day she learned she mattered," said Vera. Lily kneaded dough beside her father, her small hands stronger now, more confident. She had stopped asking when they would go home, because home had become this kitchen, these strange children, this work that her mother had taught her father and her father was teaching her. The knowledge that feeding someone was the oldest way to say you matter. Other stations heard about the croissants. Requests came, from refugee centers, across 3 sectors, asking for training, for recipes, for the kind of care that could not be synthesized or optimized. Reese began traveling once a month, leaving the kitchen in capable hands, teaching others that transformation required time and repetition and the willingness to fold the same dough 6 times, even when efficiency demanded shortcuts. Dr. Amaro Say was promoted to Director of Nutritional Cultural Programs, a position created specifically because someone finally understood that feeding bodies without feeding spirits was just slow starvation by another name. She wore her grandmother's scarf to every meeting and kept a croissant on her desk as a reminder that bureaucracy should serve people, not the other way around. On a morning 6 months after the first batch, Reese stood at the kitchen window watching dawn break over Covenant Station. Sarah and Lily sat together at a table, counting layers in a croissant they had made themselves. Their voices blended, human numbers and alien song, creating something neither language could achieve alone. 128 reasons to keep living, folded into butter and dough by hands that cared enough to count them all. Vera joined him at the window. "You gave her back her life," said Vera. Reese watched his daughter laugh at something Sierra said, their friendship transcending translation. "No," said Reese. "I just remembered that some things are worth the time they take." The rest was already inside her, waiting to rise.